Have you ever stopped to think what a wild animal would be capable of when all that's left is despair? What if I told you that, one freezing dawn in the heart of Alaska, a bear in trouble did something no one ever thought possible? Get ready to dive into one of the most exciting and surprising stories in the animal world, a true bear rescue in an extreme situation, which will stir your emotions and challenge everything you believe about wild instinct. Just imagine the silent city covered in a white blanket of snow, while the thermometers plummeted to 45 degrees C. In the midst of the darkness and biting cold, security cameras recorded a surreal scene. A wild bear, visibly scared, staggering through the empty streets, as if looking for something or someone. It wasn't just any bear. It was Sakari, known by local residents for being one of the last brown bears to roam around that village forgotten by the world. But that night, Sakari wasn't just lost. He carried in his eyes a silent cry for help, a sign of desperation that no one could ignore. Heartwarming animal rescue stories always touch us, but this one goes beyond that. We are not just talking about an animal in danger, but a wild brown bear that, breaking all the codes of nature, dared to cross the limits of the human world in search of help. A cub in trouble would perhaps have been understood. But an adult bear, huge, feared, knocking on the doors of a police station? Nobody expected that. The burning question is, what leads such a powerful creature, a symbol of strength and freedom, to surrender to the territory of men? What happened to Sakari that freezing night that made him defy his own instincts and risk everything? You will now discover a narrative that mixes suffering, hope, and an unlikely connection between man and beast. Because sometimes, even the fiercest beast needs an invisible embrace that only human compassion can provide. The bear's sign of desperation was not just a coincidence. It was a wake-up call, a silent cry amidst the chaos of the Arctic. A true story that shocked not only the small town of Utqiagvik, but also the entire world when the images were leaked. A true animal cry for help, recorded on camera, capable of bringing tears to even the hardest of hearts. You won't believe what was behind that moment. If you follow stories of rescued animals, bears in danger, abandoned cubs, and moments that challenge the boundaries between animal instinct and human feeling, get ready. What happened in that Alaskan police station goes far beyond anything that has ever been told. We are not talking about fiction. We are talking about life, about loss, about a scene that was forever etched in the memory of the few who witnessed it. And the most impressive? It all started with a simple gesture. An act that, for many, only seemed strange, but which carried a devastating secret behind it. A gesture that transformed an ordinary morning into the biggest story of animal rescue in an extreme situation ever seen in that region. You're about to understand the real reason behind Sakari's lost look and why her sign of desperation shocked even the most experienced officers at that station. Now, pay attention, because from here the story only gets more intense. It was impossible to ignore what was happening that freezing dawn in January 2019. The city of Utqiagvik, in the far north of Alaska, seemed even more isolated from the world in that harsh winter. There, where the wind cuts like a blade and the sky remains plunged in darkness for weeks on end, every unusual sound echoes like an omen. In a place where few dare to live, where nature sets the rules and the cold can be deadly, the appearance of a grizzly bear wandering the snow-covered streets was not just a rare sight. It was a sign that something out of the ordinary was about to happen. Sakari, as he was called by the few inhabitants of the village, was already known in that inhospitable region. He was not just another wild animal among many others that silently roamed the white immensity of the Arctic. Sakari had been seen a few times in the distance, always distant, watching from ice-covered hills, like a silent guardian of the tundra. For the Inuit, who carry generations of deep respect for nature and bears, he was more than an animal. He was a living symbol of the strength and resilience of wildlife. But that night, something about Sakari was different. He didn't hide in the shadows. He didn't wander just for food. He walked straight towards the city, where no bear in his right mind would dare go. The cold that night was unrelenting. The thermometers registered an impressive 40 fuisadig, and the wind blew as if it wanted to tear the skin. It was the type of climate that forces any creature to retreat, to seek shelter, to fight for its own survival. Even so, there was Sakari, dragging her heavy paws over the hardened snow, with her gaze lost, as if carrying an invisible burden. Utqiagvik is not just any city. With just over 4,000 inhabitants, this isolated community lives daily, with the fragile balance between the human world and wild nature. The inhabitants grow up learning to respect the rules of the Arctic. Never feed a bear, never approach, never let your guard down. Bears are respected, admired, but also feared. They represent both the brutal beauty of nature and the imminent danger of an unexpected encounter. So when the small police station's security cameras recorded that lone bear approaching without hesitation, alarms didn't just sound on the monitors. They echoed in the chest of every resident who heard what happened that night. That was unprecedented. It was inexplicable. No bear approaches like that, not without reason. The streets were deserted. The early morning silence was only broken by the sound of the wind and the heavy dragging of Sakari's paws. The dim light from the streetlights illuminated the snow that was falling slowly, painting the city in almost ghostly white. And, amidst that frozen scenery, that giant shadow walked, slow, determined, and scared. It didn't take long for messages to start circulating on local radio groups. Bear in town. Has anyone seen Sakari on the main street? He's going to the police station. It was hard to believe. The Utqiagvik police station, a simple wooden building reinforced against the cold, had never been the scene of such a surreal scene. It wasn't just a bear invading an urban space. It was a silent request, a behavior that went against everything the residents knew about wildlife. The community's elders remembered the old stories told by their Inuit grandparents, legends about bears that crossed human paths when something was out of balance, when nature cried out for help. But in real life, that didn't make sense. Sakari wasn't there by chance. As police officers watched in bewilderment on security cameras, it became clear to everyone that this was no ordinary bear looking for food or shelter. His movements were heavy, not with threat but with sadness. He walked like someone carrying the world on his shoulders. He approached the entrance of the police station, stopped for a few moments, and simply sat in front of the door, staring into space like an exhausted traveler who finally reached his destination. It was at that moment that many understood. This was not a simple animal in trouble. This was a story of help, of silent desperation, of a grown-up puppy in trouble, carrying with him a request that no one there knew how to interpret. Yet, local customs have always warned, when a bear invades your space, it's not just hunger or cold. It is a sign of imbalance, of imminent tragedy. The fear was there, but mixed with something bigger, something impossible to explain at that moment. A wild bear, a symbol of raw nature, sitting at the door of a human police station. Something was broken. As the internal police radio buzzed with questions, as the city's residents gathered at the windows, trying to make sense of the impossible, there was a profound silence that no one could ignore. Sakari's silence. That lost look, that tired body brought with it a weight that no one there knew. Yet, the entire city, frozen under the eternal Arctic snow, knew that this story was just beginning. The question that hung in the air was the same one that you, watching this video now, must also be asking. Why was Sakari there? What happened in that icy forest to make a bear break all the rules of its instinct and seek help from humans? That's exactly what we're going to reveal below, because what those officers discovered while following Sakari's tracks forever changed everything they believed about the invisible bonds between man and animal. The minutes that followed that surreal scene seemed to last an eternity for those who were there, following in real time what the police station's cameras were showing. Anyone looking from the outside might think it was just another dawn in Utqiagvik, a frozen village in the most forgotten corner of the planet. But for those who knew the behavior of grizzly bears, for those who grew up hearing stories of dangerous encounters and foretold tragedies, what was happening that night was unlike anything else. And scary. The image was clear, raw, almost impossible to interpret by human logic. Sakari, the wild brown bear, the same one that had already been seen countless times wandering far away across the tundra, was now sitting at the door of a police station, motionless, silent, as if waiting to be attended to. He didn't growl, he didn't threaten, he didn't try to invade or attack. He was just there, exhausted, weakened, like someone who no longer had the strength to fight his own pain. For an animal like Sakari, used to traveling hundreds of kilometers between icy mountains, dark forests, and frozen lakes, that gesture was a silent scream. It was the biggest sign that something was terribly wrong, because a bear in trouble, even in its fragility, will never approach humans. They flee, hide, attack, but do not surrender. That night, Sakari had surrendered. As the cameras recorded every second of that senseless moment, the officers inside the station stood transfixed. Nobody knew what to do. The rules were clear. Bears are dangerous, unpredictable, and should not be encouraged to approach. But there was no threat there. There was a silent cry for help, and that affected everyone. The messages on the radios continued, one after another. There's a bear sitting at the door. He's not trying to break in, he's just waiting. What should we do? On the other side of the transmissions, residents woke up to the buzz peering through ice-covered windows, trying to understand how this could be real. Some remembered old stories from their elders, Inuit legends about bears who, when they lost everything, sought help from those they once learned to fear. Others only saw danger, a tragedy waiting to happen. The tension that morning didn't just come from the biting cold that burned the skin, or the sound of the wind whistling through the deserted streets. It came from that heavy silence, that immobile bear, that empty gaze that stared at the closed door of the police station. Something about that look was different. There was no anger, no fury, no hunger. There was pain, and it wasn't physical pain. It was something bigger, something invisible. The officers watched in astonishment. No training had prepared them for this. How to act when the unimaginable happens. How do you react when one of nature's most feared predators behaves like a lost child on your doorstep? There was a weight to that scene that no one could explain, but everyone felt it. It was as if the Arctic itself, silent and immense, had sent that animal there to warn humans of something terrible. Minutes passed and Sakari didn't move. His breathing was heavy. His eyes didn't look away. The internal radio registered nervous whispers. "Does he look hurt?" someone asked. "I don't see any injuries, but he's weak," replied another. The truth is that no one knew what to do, and the entire city was already awake, connected by an invisible tension, unable to take their eyes off that scene. Outside, the wind continued to punish the snow accumulated in the corners. But inside the police station, a different cold dominated the environment. It wasn't the cold of the Arctic. It was the cold of uncertainty, of fear of the unknown, of the feeling that this unexpected visit was just the beginning of something much bigger. When a brown bear, a symbol of strength and wild freedom, gives up the forest and seeks shelter among men, something broke. And it wasn't just in nature. It was in the invisible balance that sustains the animal world and ours. That early morning carried with it a weight that could not be ignored. The most experienced people in the village were already murmuring among themselves that a bear never appears like that for no reason. That for him to have walked through the darkness, ignored the danger, broken all the rules of animal instinct, and sat before a human police station, some tragedy had occurred. Something irreparable. And as the watchful eyes of police officers, residents, and now thousands of people on social media watched that surreal image in real time, one question echoed silently through every corner of Utqiagvik. What did Sakari want to tell us? It was impossible not to feel a lump in your throat when watching that scene, as if everyone was facing a dark secret about to be revealed. And the answer, as you will discover in the next few minutes, was buried in the snow, hidden among footprints and tracks almost erased by the wind. But before I continue this unbelievable story, one of the most moving you'll ever see about bears in distress, extreme animal rescue, and the surprising connection between humans and wildlife, I need to ask you one important thing. If this story has touched your heart so far, if you feel like you need to follow it until the end to understand the real reason for Sakari's desperate signal, then leave your subscription here on the channel and activate the bell. Because real stories like this, which show how much more animals have to say than we imagine, you can only find here in Puppy in Trouble. Now, get ready. Because what was discovered while following Sakari's tracks that freezing night is going to shock you. The hours following Sakari's appearance at the police station door were a real thriller for the entire small town of Utqiagvik. Outside, the cold was unrelenting. The snow continued to fall slowly, heavily, covering the streets and sidewalks as if it wanted to erase the footprints of that unlikely visitor. But nothing could erase what had been recorded that morning. The image of the brown bear in trouble, sitting at the door of the only police station in the village, had already been circulated on the local radio, in message groups, and at that moment was beginning to spread around the world. Inside the police station, as officers tried to decide what to do, the atmosphere was one of complete perplexity. No one there had seen anything like it. Sakari remained motionless, like a living shadow in the doorway, as if he had been placed there by some greater force. It wasn't common, it wasn't natural, it wasn't instinct. Everything at that moment screamed that there was a secret hidden in that attitude. Among the agents present, one of them couldn't take his eyes off the screen. Officer Tunic, a man born and raised in that icy land, a direct descendant of the ancient Inuit hunters, knew the signs that nature sent like few others. And at that moment he knew he was facing a sign. It wasn't just an animal seeking shelter from the cold. It was something much bigger. Tunic breathed deeply, staring at those meaningless images. He knew the history of every bear in that region. He knew their behavior. He knew that never in his entire life had a bear voluntarily crossed the invisible line between the forest and the city. For a wild bear in danger, seeking shelter from humans was like signing his own sentence. This did not happen without a desperate reason. He called Sakari by name, even though the bear couldn't hear him through the cameras. "Why are you here, old friend?" he murmured to himself, as if searching the stars for an answer. The camera showed details that few would notice. Sakari's blank look, his dejected posture, the almost imperceptible tremor of his paws, as if he were exhausted, defeated by something that no human there could see. It was at that moment that a detail caught Tunic's attention. One of the external cameras, positioned at the top of the building, showed something strange. Small, dark spots in the snow, a trail almost erased by the wind. Blood, marks that came from very far away, getting lost between the houses and then disappearing into the white expanse. The internal radio crackled with another officer's nervous voice. "Tunic, we need to decide. Shall we try to fend him off? What if he attacks?" But Tunic did not respond immediately. He knew deep down that Sakari wasn't there to attack. He was there because he had nowhere else to go. Meanwhile, outside, residents began to discreetly gather at the windows. There was no longer any way to hold back the news. The images circulated, went viral, shocked. What would make a wild animal, accustomed to the freedom of the forests and the silence of the mountains, seek refuge in the heart of human territory? Why would a grizzly bear in desperation cross all that distance, risking its life, just to sit outside a police station? Theories began to emerge, each one more absurd than the last. Some said that the extreme cold had left the animal confused. Others believed that it was sick, on the verge of death, seeking warmth. But for Tunic, it wasn't simple. He knew that for a bear like Sakari, approaching men was the last alternative. It was a silent request, a desperate gesture that no one could yet decipher. The camera showed Sakari's eyes up close. There was no anger, there was no fear, just empty. It was as if he was carrying a secret so heavy that he could no longer bear it alone. Tunic then decided to leave the surveillance room. He grabbed his thick coat, his flashlight, and walked out the door towards that colossal, silent figure. Every step he took in the snow was like crossing an invisible border, where man and beast were no longer separated by fear, but united by something greater. He approached slowly, keeping a safe distance but with a steady gaze. "Sakari," he called in a low voice, although he knew the bear wouldn't understand his words, but perhaps he would understand the tone. The wind cut Tunik's face like a razor, but he didn't look away. Neither does Sakari. For a few seconds that seemed like an eternity, the two remained there, facing each other, while the world around them seemed to freeze even more. It was at that moment that Tunik noticed a detail that no one had noticed. Sakari wasn't just exhausted, he was wet, his heavy, dark fur soaked through, as if he had crossed icy rivers or lakes to get here. His eyes betrayed more than fatigue. They carried the shadow of fear and of something he had left behind. Tunik knew he needed to find out the truth, and that truth was out there, beyond the dim city lights, lost in the icy expanse of the Arctic. But before going in search of the answers that Sakari couldn't give in words, Tunik made a point of recording a message for everyone who, that morning, was following that unbelievable scene on the internet, on local radio, through the messages that spread faster than the wind in that city. If you, like us here in Utqiagvik, can't stop thinking about what could have led this bear to us, subscribe to the channel now and stay with us, because this story is just beginning. And what we find as we follow Sakari's tracks may be more shocking than any of us imagine. Tunik knew that the real mystery wasn't there, in that silent door. It was on the way back through the snow, what Sakari had left behind, and what he, and all of us, would need to have the courage to discover. When the clock struck just after 4 in the morning, the atmosphere inside the police station had already completely changed. What began as a strange, tension-filled warning had now turned into silent uneasiness. No one there could take their eyes off the screens that still showed Sakari, motionless, sitting in front of the door, defying everything that was known about animal behavior. But it was what was happening outside, beyond the camera, beyond the city, that began to consume everyone's minds. Officer Tunik was the first to verbalize what was already an unspoken consensus among everyone present. They needed to find out why that bear in trouble had broken all the rules of his instinct and come there. It was no longer a security issue. It was a question of humanity. Something had happened in that frozen tundra, something so serious that it pushed a wild beast to the edge of despair. Without waiting for orders from above or bureaucratic protocols that, at that moment, seemed too small compared to the gravity of what was before them, Tunik put on his thick coat, adjusted his gloves, checked his ammunition, not because he intended to use it, but because the Arctic was unpredictable, and called 2 trusted colleagues. They didn't hesitate. They knew that it was necessary to follow the trail left by Sakari in the snow. Outside, the wind continued relentlessly. The city's dim lights could barely illuminate the first few meters beyond the police station. Still, the footprints were there, marked in the snow like fresh scars. They were large, deep, revealing the weight of that bear, but also its exhaustion. Tunik walked ahead, his eyes alert, his body tense. With every step, one could feel that something terrible awaited them. Sakari's trail was not random. It went in a straight line, crossing empty streets, descending a small slope and then disappearing into the darkness of the ice-covered hills. As they advanced, the officers began to notice details that escaped the sight of anyone who didn't know that land. Dark spots mixed with the snow, tracks that didn't just belong to Sakari. There were smaller, confused, disordered marks there. Cub prints. Tunik exchanged a dark look with his colleagues. They didn't need to say anything. The scenario began to unfold before them, like a macabre puzzle that only now made sense. The trail continued for more than 2 kilometers, taking them away from the city, toward a cliff the locals called Tunik Ka, the place where the wind howls the loudest. It was a well-known but avoided location. There, the cold seemed even more cruel, and ancient stories said that anyone who got too close could hear nature's cries. When they finally reached the top, the scenery they found cut deep, far beyond the cold that enveloped them. At the edge of the cliff, where the snow had been violently disturbed, there were clear signs of a struggle. Deep marks, messy footprints, dark stains that colored the immaculate white of the floor. The officers knew, without needing words, that this was no accident. There, in that remote, icy place, something brutal had happened. Tunic knelt near one of the marks, running his gloved hand over the frozen ground. It was blood. And it wasn't just from Sakari. It was scattered, mixed with smaller footprints, signs that at least 2 cubs had been there and were no longer there. The officer took a deep breath, closing his eyes for a moment, like someone carrying the weight of the world. Now he understood. Sakari wasn't just exhausted. He was devastated. The marks were clear. There were traces of a fight against another animal, perhaps more than one. The signs left little doubt. The cubs had been attacked, possibly by predators or even other bears. The Arctic does not forgive weakness, and Sakari, it seemed, had fought to the last drop of strength to defend his family. The silence there at the top of the cliff was absolute, broken only by the distant sound of the wind and the heavy breathing of the men who witnessed that devastating scene. There were no more footprints following from there. The tracks ended at the cliff next to the blood, the struggle and the void. Sakari's puppies weren't there. There were no bodies, just traces of something irreversible. This was the weight that Sakari had carried to the police station door. He wasn't just looking for shelter. I was looking for answers. I was looking for help. Or maybe just someone who was able to look into his eyes and understand the pain he could no longer carry alone. Tunic remained kneeling for long minutes, feeling the cold penetrate his bones. It wasn't just his body that was shaking. It was the heart. Because there, in that remote place, he had understood that the pain of that bear was much greater than any wild animal should bear. And now I want to hear from you, who has been following this story so far. I want you to comment below. One word that summarizes what you are feeling at this moment, upon discovering Sakari's pain and despair. Write the word strength in the comments, so that his story and that of his puppies are never forgotten, and so that we can continue together until the end of this journey. Because what Tunic and his colleagues discovered after this will impact you even more. The night in Utqiagvik seemed even darker after the discovery made on the cliff. The wind continued to blow strong, whistling between the icy slopes as if it were nature's own lament for the tragedy that had happened there. Officer Tunic and his small team remained silent, observing the devastating scene, trying to digest everything they had just seen. The marks in the snow, the scattered blood, the interrupted tracks. Everything pointed to a single painful truth. Sakari had lost her puppies there in that cold and cruel place. It was as if every detail of that scene told a story that men were not yet able to fully hear. Small, desperate footprints next to Sakari's large, heavy footprints. Marks of struggle, blood mixed with ice, and then nothingness. No trail of escape, no signs of life. Just silence. Just absence. To anyone who knew the behavior of a grizzly bear in distress, that was clear. He had tried to protect them, fought to the end, and failed. Tunic looked around, feeling the weight of that moment pressing into his chest, like the cold that now seemed to have frozen his soul. It wasn't just a jungle attack scene. It was a raw portrait of what it means to survive in that savage world. A world where not even the strongest are safe, where even the giants of nature can be destroyed by chance, the hunger of other predators, or simply the relentless violence of the Arctic. As they walked back along the trail, Tunic's every step was heavier than the last. He knew that same morning, Sakari had made the opposite walk, alone, injured, without his puppies by his side. And he had gone to the police station not because he was looking for shelter, but because he had nothing left to lose. That gesture, that behavior that had shocked the entire city, now made sense. It was a cry for help from those who had nowhere else to run. When they returned to the city, Tunic made a point of not telling everything immediately. He needed to understand. He needed to process what he had seen. He needed to find a way to communicate to these people what this endangered bear had gone through without it sounding like just another tragedy on the pages of the newspapers. But there was something he couldn't ignore. One detail that kept playing in his mind as he walked back through the snow: the marks of other animals around the site of the attack. They were confusing tracks, too small to be those of another adult bear. Sharp, scattered footprints. Wolves. Or maybe men. He couldn't be sure, but Tunic knew that this wasn't just an accident of nature. Someone or something had taken part in that fight, and he needed to find out what. When they arrived at the police station again, the city was still awake. The lights in the houses were still on, and social media was already buzzing with the story. Sakari was still there, at the entrance, lying in the snow, motionless with his eyes staring into space, as if he knew that the men had followed in his footsteps, as if he expected them to understand. Tunic didn't need to say anything. It was enough for his gaze to meet Sakari's for the silent message to be delivered. The officer approached slowly, keeping his distance, respecting that immense and fragile animal at the same time. He knew Sakari couldn't understand his words, but he needed to speak. "I saw it, old friend," he whispered, his voice almost carried by the wind. "I saw what happened up there. I saw what you missed." It was at that moment that something changed. Sakari looked up for the first time since arriving at the police station. His gaze met Tunic's in a way neither of them would ever forget. There was no anger. There was no fear. There was pain. A deep, silent pain that crossed any barrier between man and animal. Tunic knew that the story couldn't end there. I needed to understand what else was behind that attack. I needed to find out who or what had caused this tragedy, because for a wild bear, a cry for help never comes alone. There's always something bigger hiding under the snow. As he watched Sakari lay his heavy head back down on his paws, almost as if giving up on existence, Tunic made a silent decision. I wasn't going to let that story end like that. That fight hadn't been just Sakari's. Now it was his too. And you who are here following this story need to help me take this message forward. Because there are battles that cannot be fought alone. I want you to comment one word below, a single word that sums up what you are feeling right now, after knowing what this bear in trouble faced. Write the word courage here in the comments. Because only those who have courage are capable of continuing to hear such a painful story and still move forward to discover the truth. And I tell you what Tunic will find in the next few hours could be even more shocking than everything that has been revealed so far. Dawn in Utqiagvik brought no relief. When the first traces of light began to appear on the icy horizon, the entire city seemed to have aged a decade in that single night. The cold remained relentless, as if the Arctic itself shared the silent pain that hovered over that village. Outside the police station, Sakari was still there, lying motionless, like a living statue sculpted by tragedy. Inside the building, Officer Tunic couldn't take his eyes off the window. He had spent the last few hours without sleeping, mulling over every detail of that devastating scene on the cliff. It was impossible not to imagine the desperate struggle of that bear in trouble, trying to protect its cubs, fighting against the impossible, losing everything, and, even so, having the strength to walk there, to the men, to those it once learned to fear, to leave its sign of despair. Tunic's mind was racing. There was something about that story that still didn't make sense. The marks in the snow, the strange footprints around the site of the attack, the absence of the puppies' bodies. Everything screamed that there was more to this tragedy than met the eye. That was when a detail came back to him. Information that, in the heat of the moment, had gone unnoticed. As he surveyed the scene of the attack, he clearly remembered seeing sled marks mixed in with the footprints. Recent, fresh marks almost covered by snow, but they were there. Someone had passed by that place after the attack. Tunic felt his stomach drop. That changed everything. It was no longer just a story of savage tragedy. It was a clear indication of human intervention. Someone, for some reason, was there, on that cliff, after Sakari lost her kits. The question now was, why? He knew he needed to act quickly. The weather was cruel in that region. The snow could erase any trace at any time, forever burying the answers he needed to find. And, more than ever, Sakari deserved these answers. It wasn't just for him. It was because of everything that scene represented. For the silent struggle of animals that daily face the merciless forces of nature, and often, of men themselves. Wasting no time, Tunic brought his team back together. They left before the sun completely broke the gray sky, following the clues that now seemed so obvious. The sled tracks ran from a remote point near the southern edge of the cliff and ran down the slope to an icy valley where some hunting families used to spend the night. With each meter advanced, the officer felt the weight of that investigation growing on his shoulders. He knew that, here in this land forgotten by the world, it was not uncommon for men to try to justify their actions with empty excuses about survival and tradition. But that wasn't tradition. It was cruelty in disguise. When they finally reached the valley, the scene before them was almost as painful as what they had seen on the cliff. Remnants of camp, erased trails, and in the midst of the upturned snow, small pieces of chains, remains of food, clear signs that someone had captured something, or someone, that night. Tunic slowly approached one of the places where the snow seemed most disturbed. There, shrouded in ice, he found what he was looking for, an unmistakable tuft of soft fur, too small to belong to Sakari. It belonged to a puppy. The officer felt his blood run cold. Now there were no more doubts. The cubs had not been devoured by predators. They had been taken, captured by human hands. The revolt that exploded within him at that moment was silent, but profound. What previously seemed to be just a brutal remnant of nature now revealed itself as something even worse. The mark of greed, ignorance, and the coldness of men who, even in the face of the wild immensity, still found ways to hurt those who could not defend themselves. As his team continued to search the place for more clues, Tunic knelt there, in front of that tuft of fur, and closed his eyes for a moment. Everything made sense now. Sakari's desperate journey, the silent request for help at the police station, the infinite pain in her eyes. He had seen his cubs taken away, fought to the end, lost, and without knowing where else to go, he had resorted to the only thing he had left: human compassion. And this is where I need, once again, your participation. Because this story isn't just about a bear in danger or the brutality of an attack in the wild. It's about choices, about what we are capable of doing as humanity in the face of the pain of those who have no voice. If you've made it this far, if you're feeling the weight of this story like me, I want you to comment now, here below, on a word that carries everything that Sakari represents at this moment: justice. Write this word in the comments so that this story reaches as many people as possible, and so that we can, together, move forward in the search for truth. And get ready, because what Tunic and his team are about to discover could be even more devastating than anything revealed so far. The wind was cutting like razors as Tunic and his team began to follow the new tracks they found in that silent valley. Now everything was clear. What seemed like just a savage tragedy had revealed itself as something much more cruel. A cold, calculated human intervention, hidden behind the icy silence of the Arctic. The weight of that discovery seemed to increase with each step, as if the very ground beneath her feet carried the pain of Sakari and her cubs. The sled tracks wound their way through the snow-covered hills, winding along paths known only to seasoned hunters. They were no ordinary hunters. That wasn't subsistence. That was illegal hunting, wildlife smuggling. And now it wasn't just a crime. It was a direct affront to the compassion, to the silent connection between man and animal that story had from the beginning. With each meter advanced, Tunic felt his chest tighten. He knew there was a real chance that the cubs were no longer alive. Did you know that most of the time when hunters capture bear cubs, it is not to save them? It is to sell them, exploit them, profit from their suffering. That hurt like a knife in his soul. Not just as an officer of the law, but as a man who had looked into Sakari's eyes and seen there a desperate plea, a lament that he was only now beginning to fully understand. The road was long, and time was against them. The cold seemed to want to erase all traces, as if the Arctic itself wanted to hide that shame. But Tunic was not willing to stop. Not after everything I had seen. Not after everything Sakari had lost. It was near dawn on the second day of their search that they finally spotted signs of camp in a remote area, hidden among the hills. Campfire remains, fresh footprints, empty provisions boxes, chain marks in the snow. The smell of smoke still hung in the air, mixed with the metallic scent of dried blood. Tunic approached in silence, his eyes sweeping over every detail as if trying to mentally reconstruct what had happened there. It was then that he saw, next to a small slope, tied in an improvised enclosure, two small brown bear cubs, covered in snow, motionless, their eyes closed, as if they had given up fighting. Tunic's heart almost stopped. They were there, alive, but so weak, so scared, that they seemed on the verge of the end. The thin skin, the wet and tangled hair, the dull eyes. They were just shadows of what they should have been. Wild cubs, who until a few days ago ran free through the icy forests, protected by the immense strength of their mother and father. Next to them, remains of traps, boxes, ropes. Evidence that someone had captured those puppies for one purpose, to profit from their suffering. They were just merchandise for those men, nothing more. Tunic felt a silent fury rise within him. But at that moment, stronger than anger, was the weight of the mission he carried. He needed to get them out of there. He needed to do for them what Sakari, even with all his strength, had not been able to do. With extreme caution, he and his team approached the cubs. They didn't react. They were so exhausted, so hurt, that they only shivered slightly when they felt human hands. But Tunic knew that this was just the beginning. Physical rescue was just one part. The real challenge would be to give them back their lost freedom, dignity, and perhaps their lost confidence. As they wrapped the fragile little bodies in blankets, as they checked to see if they were still breathing hard, as they carefully carried that piece of hope back to the city, Tunic knew that this story had changed everything. Not just for him, not just for Utqiagvik, but for anyone who ever thought wild animals weren't capable of calling for help. And you who are here, following every detail of this real story, this desperate fight for the life of a puppy in trouble, this silent connection between humans and animals, I want you to be part of this with me. If you felt your heart sink when you imagined those little bears surrounded, defenseless, awaiting a fate that no one deserves, comment below a word that carries all this pain and this hope that we are sharing. Freedom. Write that word in the comments now. Because Sakari and her cub's journey isn't over yet, and what happens when they finally meet again will make you believe that, even in the coldest Arctic, miracles can happen. The city of Utqiagvik has never been as silent as it was on the afternoon of that day. It was as if the entire village, the snow-covered houses, the empty streets, and even the gray sky were waiting for a moment that no one dared to imagine. The officer's return to the police station was not discreet. As the makeshift sled carrying the two little bear cubs crossed the icy streets, the windows were filled with watchful eyes, anxious hearts, and whispers that ran faster than the wind. They found them. Tunic walked at the front of the group, his gaze fixed and his shoulders loaded with an invisible weight. His footsteps marked the ground as if each footprint was a scar from the previous night. Behind him, wrapped in thick blankets, Sakari's two puppies remained motionless, fragile, scared. They had survived, yes, but they were far from safe. They were broken, like loose pieces of a story of pain waiting for a different ending. When they arrived at the police station, Sakari was still there. It hadn't moved much since Tunic and his team left. He seemed to have entered a state of deep torpor, as if his soul was hibernating, while his body remained waiting for a miracle that he himself no longer believed possible. But at that moment, when the sled stopped in front of the police station and the smell of their puppies mingled with the freezing air, something changed. Small, almost imperceptible. Sakari's eyes, which until then had been empty, unmoving, blinked. He raised his head slowly, as if afraid to believe what he felt. Tunic ordered them to keep their distance. He knew he needed to be careful. I knew that this reunion would be delicate, tense, perhaps even dangerous. But deep down, I also knew that there was something bigger guiding those steps. The puppies, even though they were weak, began to make small sounds, soft moans, almost whispers, as if calling out to a ghost from the past. Sakari responded with a low, deep noise that echoed like a wave of emotion through the frozen air. This wasn't just animal communication. It was a lament. It was recognition. It was love. No one dared to move. Police officers, residents, everyone watched in complete silence as Utqiagvik, with all the care in the world, slowly brought the puppies closer to the entrance of the police station. The small bodies trembled slightly, but their gazes began to instinctively seek that huge and familiar figure before them. Sakari didn't need more than a second to understand. When the puppy's eyes met his, the impossible happened. He stood up, slowly, still shaky, and took 2 hesitant steps forward. The tension in the air was unbearable. Everyone there knew they were witnessing something that nature rarely allows men to see. Then, with an almost ritual movement, Sakari lowered herself in front of her cubs, gently resting her head on them. There were no words to describe that scene. There was no narrative that could capture the weight of that moment. It was an impossible reunion. It was pain dissolved in the cold air. It was the end of a desperate search and the beginning of a new fight for life. The cubs nestled under Sakari's immense body, as if nothing else existed in the world. There, between the cold concrete of the city and the snow that was beginning to fall again, a family had been restored. Bruised, broken, but alive, Utqiagvik turned his face away for a moment. There was no holding back the tears. He knew that the battle was not over yet. He knew the cubs were too weak to survive on their own. That Sakari, even reunited with them, would need help to ensure that story didn't end in tragedy. But at that moment, none of that mattered. What mattered was that they had found their way back to each other. The news spread like fire through ice. People began to leave their homes, silently, respectfully, just to witness that scene that seemed to have come out of an impossible tale. Some were crying, others just watched in silence, knowing they were witnessing a wild miracle that would never happen again. And now I want to hear from you, who is here until now following every detail of this painful journey, this fight for life, this deep connection between man and animal. I want you to go to the comments and write a word that sums up this moment, this reunion, this second chance that not everyone has in life. Hope. Write this word so that more people can find this story and feel, just as you are feeling now, that even in the darkest darkness, even in the most brutal cold, there can always be a ray of hope. And get ready, because Sakari and her cubs' battle is far from over. What they still have to face to finally return to freedom will leave you speechless. Sakari's reunion with her puppies had been one of those moments that leaves an impression on the soul of those who witness it. But there, on that icy ground of Utqiagvik, where wildlife and human life intersected so fragilely, everyone knew that this scene was not the end of the story. It was just the beginning of a new and difficult journey. The cubs, although alive, were in critical condition. Their small bodies, still weakened by trauma, cold, and hunger, required immediate care. And Sakari, although he seemed momentarily relieved, was just the shadow of the bear that had once roamed free in the frozen forests of Alaska. He was weak, hungry, exhausted to the core. Utqiagvik knew the next step wasn't easy. They needed to act quickly to ensure that this family had a real chance of survival. The entire city mobilized like never before. Those who, hours ago, saw the bear as a possible danger now understood that they were facing a story bigger than any fear or protective instinct. It was about empathy, about humanity, about the invisible force that connects all living beings when everything seems lost. Local veterinarians were called. Volunteers showed up with blankets, food, saline solution, anything that could help. The police station, once a place of control and rules, had become an improvised refuge for 3 lives that had been brutally broken, and that were now beginning, little by little, to try to rebuild themselves. Utqiagvik monitored everything closely, coordinating efforts, ensuring that no movement was too sudden, too invasive. He knew that Sakari, despite showing gratitude in his own way, remained a wild animal, governed by instincts, marked by traumas that no man would be able to erase. The puppies were slow to react. For days they remained lethargic, without appetite, with their eyes dimmed, like someone who had already given up on the world. But little by little, With patience, warmth, and care, they began to show signs of life. They began to recognize the smells, to look for their father's body for shelter, to make small sounds that sounded like shy requests for comfort. And Sakari, Sakari. He was the embodiment of strength and vulnerability at the same time. He spent hours lying next to the puppies, almost without moving, as if he didn't want that moment to end. As if he knew that there, surrounded by men and their rules, his freedom had been temporarily replaced by something greater, the chance to save those he loved most. With each passing day, the residents of Utqiagvik took turns watching, feeding, and protecting this unlikely family. The city's children began leaving small notes at the entrance to the police station, wishing the bear and her cubs strength. Old Inuit hunters whispered that this was a sign from the ancient spirits of the Arctic, showing that even the strongest need help. But even amid this wave of compassion, Tunik could not rest. He knew that beyond the temporary warmth of the blankets and the solidarity of the residents, there was a truth that no one could ignore. Sakari and her puppies did not belong there. They did not belong to the improvised bars, nor to the constant gazes. They belonged to the forest, the tundra, the icy silence of the mountains, and for that to be possible, they would need to be strong again. They would need to overcome not only the physical wounds, but the invisible scars they carried. Sakari's fight at that moment was for freedom, for the chance to go back to being what he always was, a wild bear, a father, a survivor. Meanwhile, Tunik was preparing everything for the most important moment in this story. He knew that once the cubs were strong enough, it would be time to release them, to take them back to the place they should never have been taken from. But I also knew that this moment would be difficult, because the pain of separation, even when necessary, is a weight that few are prepared to carry. The Arctic does not forgive weakness. The wild world offers no guarantees. But in that small town forgotten by the world, a grizzly bear and her cubs had taught everyone a powerful lesson, that sometimes the greatest gesture of strength isn't resisting, it's allowing yourself to be helped. And now I want you, who have been following this journey so far, to participate with me in this moment. I want you to go in the comments and write one word that defines everything you felt when you saw this family being rebuilt before our eyes. Write the word Renaissance, because this story doesn't end here. The moment when Sakari and her cubs finally return to freedom is approaching, and what happens in that moment will be etched in your memory forever. The days following that historic reunion were a true emotional roller coaster for everyone in Utqiagvik. As the icy winds continued to blow mercilessly through the deserted streets, and the infinite white of the Arctic seemed to have no end, inside that small police station, life and hope blossomed in a silent and powerful way. Sakari's puppies, previously fragile and on the verge of death, now began to regain not only the strength in their bodies, but also the light in their eyes. Their every small movement, every hesitant step, every sound made was celebrated as a victory by everyone who followed that journey. And there weren't a few of them. The story of Sakari and her puppies had already crossed borders. People all over the world now waited anxiously for news of that family of bears who, against all odds, had overcome their own emotional extinction. But the most important moment was yet to come. It was time to return them to the place they should never have left. Return them to freedom. Tunik knew it wouldn't be easy. There was fear, there was attachment. Those days alongside Sakari and the puppies had changed not only the routine of a city, but also the lives of everyone who had stopped to watch, feel, and in some way participate in this story. But a true happy ending would only be possible if they returned to where they belonged. The rescue team, together with volunteers and local authorities, prepared everything carefully. A meticulous plan, respecting the time and instinct of those animals that had taught so much about compassion, pain, and resilience. The choice of location was not random. A remote stretch of icy forest, far enough away to avoid future encounters with hunters or humans, but close to Sakari's original territory. This was where they would have their second chance. On the morning of the day set for liberation, the city was silent. It was not a routine silence, but a respectful, almost sacred silence. Everyone knew they were about to witness the closing of a painful but necessary chapter. Transport was carried out with extreme care. Sakari, now visibly stronger, walked alongside the puppies, attentive, protective, as if he knew exactly what was happening. It was impressive to see how, even without words, he understood. Maybe because, deep down, that wild bear always knew that his fight wasn't just for his own life. It was for the freedom of those he loved. When they finally arrived at the chosen clearing, the wind stopped for a moment. The sky, previously full, timidly opened, as if even he wanted to witness that moment. Tunic remained a few meters away, watching. There were no fences, no more chains, just the forest, the cold, and that family of bears ready to start over. The gates of the makeshift enclosure were opened, and for a second that seemed to last an eternity. Sakari remained motionless. He looked back, straight at Tunic, a long look filled with something impossible to describe. It wasn't fear. There was no doubt. It was gratitude. It was a silent farewell between two souls who had recognized each other in despair. And then, with steady steps, Sakari crossed the snow, the cubs close behind, following him like small, determined shadows. They disappeared among the icy trees, leaving only the trail of their paws in the fresh snow, a trail that the wind would soon erase. But the mark that story had left on the hearts of those who watched it would never be erased. As silence reigned once again in the middle of the forest, Tunic closed his eyes for a moment and took a deep breath. I knew that moment would be told and retold for generations, not just as the story of a grizzly bear and her cubs in trouble, but as living proof that even in the most desperate situations, even when all seems lost, there is something within us, and within every living thing, that refuses to give up. And now, if you've come this far, if you followed every detail of this unbelievable journey, if you cried, if you hung on to every word, I want you to leave a sign that this story really touched you. Comment the word life below, because that's what we talked about all the time. Life, struggle, pain, hope, and a new beginning. And if this story moved you, I now invite you to be part of our community. Subscribe to the Filhote Emapuros channel and activate the bell, because here we tell the most impactful, most exciting, and most necessary real stories about the animal world. Stories that don't always end well, but always carry a powerful message. And share this video. Take this story forward, so that more people know that even a brown bear, alone in the Arctic, can teach the entire world the true meaning of strength, love, and freedom. See you in the next video.